Morning, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Heather Conley. I'm Senior Vice President here at CSIS that looks after Europe, Eurasia, and the Arctic. And we could not be more pleased that you have joined us today. We are going to tell you about a report that we here at the Center have been working on for the last over a year and a half in close cooperation and partnership with the Center for the Study of Democracy in Sofia, Bulgaria. I jokingly tell my colleagues it takes an analytical village to produce a 63-page, very dense report. And so before we begin, and we'll ask you to sort of bear with us, we're going to walk you through a little bit of this report, not the full 63 pages, I promise. And once we finish that conversation about the report, then we will have a conversation about it. But before I begin, let me introduce to you the authors of this report, and I would like them to stand and be acknowledged. First, let me begin with my colleague, James Mina, former research associate with the Center for Strategic International Studies and now with the Office of the Secretary of Defense. I'd like to also recognize Martin Vladimirov with the Center for the Study of Democracy, another fabulous colleague for this report. And let me acknowledge, and you'll be hearing from him soon, Ruslan Stefanov, who is the director of the economics program at the Center for the Study of Democracy. Thank you, my colleagues. This report could not be produced without you. We wanted to make this report truly transatlantic, and that's why we were so thrilled to partner with the Center for the Study of Democracy. So before we tell you about the Kremlin Playbook, let me warmly welcome the chairman of the Center for the Study of Democracy, Ognian Shentov, who will say a few words of welcome, and then we'll get to the reports. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Shentov.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you for coming today. This has been really quite a ride in the last almost couple of years when we have been focusing on Russian economic footprint in Europe. And let me just say briefly, in a nutshell, that what we try to do is to assess, to metrify this footprint, which is still largely unknown and ignored. And then run this analysis through different optics, the governance deficits, governance gaps, even I would say governance failures in Europe, both in the European Union level and national governments level, and these exactly deficits and gaps, and including the state capture in Central and East European countries, provide ample opportunities for aggressive Russian economic and political behavior. So let me finish with that, and I'd like to thank once again the core team of the project, led by Heather and Ruslan, for their leadership and persistence, and of course my colleagues Martin and James, and thank you for coming today.
Thank you so much. Well, let's begin and tell you a little bit about the Kremlin Playbook. First, I want to begin with sort of the inspiration behind what we were studying. We were struck by a letter that was written in 2009 by a very significant group of Central and Eastern European leaders to the Obama administration. It was an open letter. And while the letter had other issues regarding the US relationship with Central Europe, the relationship with Russia, within this letter it had a very interesting observation, I will say. And it's describing that Russia uses overt and covert means of economic warfare. And what we found was so interesting about that, the use of the word economic warfare, but that it was an attempt to challenge the transatlantic orientation of these countries. And we thought, well, that's an interesting statement. I wonder if that is true. Could we determine whether that was true? And then there was another. Several years later, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban gave us some additional food for thought. In a speech he gave in July of 2014, He mentioned that the wind is blowing from the east. It is possible to construct a new state built on illiberal and national foundations. And we thought perhaps that the economic dimension was having an impact on governance standards, on democratic institutions, on and in fact the democratic orientation of these two countries. And we thought that would be an interesting study if we could measure, if we could create a methodology, if we could prove in fact that there's a correlation between economic influence and a reorientation of democratic institutions. And then of course Friday happened. And then we had a pretty significant statement. I would argue that historians will reflect on this statement. I'm going to reflect on this statement for quite some time, where Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson and Director of National Intelligence General Clapper issued, I think, a fairly extraordinary statement, which, among things, mentioned about attributing particular activity to Russia. And consistent with the methods and motivations of Russian-directed efforts, such activity is not new to Moscow. The Russians have used similar tactics and techniques across Europe and Eurasia. So sometimes in the analytical world, we get really good timing. So we felt that this report perhaps could illuminate what Secretary Johnson and General Clapper were perhaps suggesting. What are the tactics and techniques that perhaps have been used in Europe today? So that was some of the, what I call the inspiration. Now let me introduce you to the perspiration of this report. We wanted to do the study questions again. Was there a direct correlation? Could we make a correlation between Russia's economic footprint in a country and a deterioration of their governance standards? If we could or could not, and we'll tell you a little bit how successful or unsuccessful we were, what's the impact? What's the amplification? What's the overall impact on the public confidence in democracies, in the institutions themselves? We wanted to get very specific. We wanted to drill down into 5 countries to understand how this worked. We can make broad general trend lines, but to understand, as we will argue, the playbook, you have to understand how it works individually in each country. So we selected 5 countries: Latvia, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Hungary, and Slovakia. Why those countries? Well, 4 out of the 5 are NATO and European Union countries. So the NATO countries, certainly the United States, has an enormous amount of investment in how they are going to be thinking about their future policy and certainly the health of their democracies. And for Serbia, we wanted to see how this playbook would work in a country that aspires to join the European Union, yet holds great cultural, historic, economic, linguistic ties with Russia. Would we see any difference? So that was, and of course we wanted broad geographic diffusion from the north of Latvia, the south in Bulgaria, and then to see, obviously, Hungary and Slovakia, the countries in between. So we wanted to focus, and this is why we're going to spend a little bit of time on the methodology and measurement. We wanted to be rigorous. We wanted to see if we could quantify the dimension of Russia's investment. Not an easy task. And thankfully, Ruslan Shentov and the Center for the Study of Democracy has taken this great burden on. So let me welcome Ruslan up to the podium, and he can tell you about our methods and methodology. Ruslan.
Thank you all very much for coming. What we were faced with is not just presenting the simple economic presence of Russia in the region, but also trying to capture the amplifiers, those instruments that actually allow Russia to amplify their economic presence. So what we have done here is we've combined 4 indicators that we think historically display to the largest extent the instruments that Russia has actually used to intimidate and to influence political decisions with those 5 countries. And then we have combined them to show that this is not just pure economics, but that they're using other instruments to amplify that economic presence. So as you can see, we've ranked these 5 countries using this combined metrics, which includes energy imports, which has been presumably the most often used economic weapon in the Kremlin playbook. We've put in there the FDI stock. We have added to that the corporate presence and the corporate networks, which we think, which has taken us the most of time, probably 6 months, to uncover all the final beneficial owners that are out there and the networks, the intricate networks that they've created. And last but not least, the other instrument that has been used, the exports to Russia. And as you can see, these countries show different levels of economic footprint, but they all show a similar trend. And we think there is a distinct, we find a distinct pattern somewhere between 2007 and 2008, when there was a change from the using the economic opportunities towards intentionally trying to steer or to use the economic presence in terms of influencing the political decisions. And that we think we see in all the patterns in the countries. Now, let me just go to the most widely used economic instrument, and that has been already widely acknowledged. That's the energy imports. As we can see, in the case of Bulgaria and Slovakia, this is the highest level. All countries have different levels, but in all of them, at least 2 of the instruments have provided a very high vulnerability to Russian influence. And these can be bundled, if in Bulgaria and Slovakia, these are energy and corporate presence. In Serbia, these are energy and corporate presence. In Slovakia and Hungary, it's mostly exports. And in Latvia, it is also a combination of mostly corporate presence and exports. So these are the different channels. But then we have uncovered that there are also different other amplifiers or patterns that have used or amplified the impact of those 4 core economic variables on the host country. And there have been different ways of actually amplifying that Russian influence. And we've listed just a few of them. And these are concentrating on monopolizing sectors, critical sectors like energy, finance, and transportations, like in the case of Latvia, using old Secret Service networks that have spanned into the financial sector and from there expanded in all different directions. And also using large scale, and this we've seen in particularly in Bulgaria and in Hungary, large scale and Serbia, large scale projects to lure local oligarchs or local key economic players that can then be used to actually amplify the Russian economic footprint in those countries. Now, let me give the one example that we've seen, but it provides a very good view of how all these mingles together, and that's the Gazprom case. And I'm going to finish up then with the cost that actually is incurred on the local economies. And as you can see, they usually act through a local corporate network of subsidiaries that corner the national incumbents and press them into basically playing along the lines that Gazprom is actually want to use. And let me finish up by showing you that you can't help but notice that the highest prices, the highest price differentials of gas is put on the countries where Russia has had the highest economic presence or the highest economic footprint, and these are Bulgaria and Serbia. So the more you're captured economically, the more you actually pay, in this case, to Gazprom. And these, you could easily make the calculus, these amounts to tens of billions of dollars over the 10 years period that we are looking at, 2004 and 2014. And with that, I would like to turn it back to Heather on explaining how the economic footprint and the political footprint intermingle. Thank you.
chart on the democratic standards because we have this incredible resource called Freedom House, and they produce an annual report, Nations in Transit. Oops, there my microphone goes. Nations in Transit, that annually provides us with an enormous amount of information on the democratic health and standards of countries in Central Europe. So what we did was, using the Freedom House's annual analysis, we looked at 3 specific indicators: perceived levels of corruption, independence of the judiciary, and media independence. That, for us, was in some ways was the health indicator of a democracy. And what we found was a little counterintuitive, particularly for those countries that joined NATO and the European Union at least by 2004, because we made an assumption that those countries would in fact only increase in democratic health. They were in major institutions, they were developing economically and democratically, yet that is not what we found. In the case of Hungary and Bulgaria and in Slovakia, there was actually a decline in governance standards. And this we were seeing over a trend line again from 2004 to 2014. Latvia was the outlier. Latvia was stable in the indicators, and we'll talk about Latvia as sort of an example, and it's a little counterintuitive example. Serbia, again, was fairly stable. The numbers that you see on the graph, and in the report, we chart country by country, and we chart the democratic standards and the economic footprint. It's a little hard to read when you're looking at it for the first time and you see lots of squiggly lines and you're not sure what those squiggly lines are meaning. But what we saw was that the democratic standards were declining as that economic influence was growing. So let me sort of get to the answer to the first study question. Is there a direct correlation between Russia's economic presence and its democratic standards, if you will? We could not find a direct correlation. In fact, the findings were quite inconclusive. But I think the most important thing about this, and now I'm going to get really to, I think, the aha of the report, was that we really observed a relationship between the economics and the politics. So as we mesh those two findings together, this is what we've observed. If Russia's economic footprint in a country is above 12% of that country's GDP, there's a pretty strong likelihood, but not absolutely, that you will see where democratic standards will decline, political influence plays an enormous role. Now here's the catch. If the country had below 12% of GDP of Russian influence, so the economics weren't the strong part, but we found, again, this gets in the case of Hungary and others, it was the political influence that seemed more powerful than the economics. And then finally, we had some different results, varied results, and this is why we wanted to make sure you understood. Our conclusions were not extremely airtight. That in some cases, for instance, Latvia, which has over 12% of GDP that's Russian economic influence, they actually had more resistance to Russian political influence. And some of that has to do, quite frankly, with their anti-corruption efforts, their transparency, and some of the strength of their institutions. And then, of course, we had Serbia, which, again, had high economic footprint, but yet we found the political influence to be that much stronger. So that was sort of that 12% line was something that we watched with great interest. So here is really the secret of the playbook. And before I begin, I want to sort of define a little bit when we talk about corruption. And we do this in the report, and I just want to emphasize, for us, corruption does have a definition. We do cite examples in the report, and we define corruption for the purposes of the report as the alleged or reported exercise of one's power, position, resources in order to exploit or exert undue influence over businesses, individuals, state bodies, institutions, typically through non-transparent or questionable means. These actions could be deliberate or unlawful, but they may not be so. We cite our observations, but these observations do not suggest or accuse any specific individuals of wrongdoing. I just want to make that perfectly clear before we begin, because corruption is, in fact, the key. So let me tell you a little bit about the unvirtuous circle. And this gets back to this flow problem, where Russian economic influence can come through the economics, through strategic sectors like energy, like finance, like the media, and then it can create, through the political influence, it can then, in some ways, metastasize, if you sort of use that analogy, and it can create space within political parties, political influence, and it then, in fact, can start acting as a corrosive element to democratic standards, reducing media freedom, purchasing media companies to eliminate independent journalism. It can be financing of political parties that want to prevent diversification of energy or to ensure that particularly protected sectors remain particularly protected. And the transition mechanism for this unvirtuous circle is, in fact, corruption. That's the transition mechanism. It can purchase local affiliates. It can then work its way with businessmen and with sometimes parliamentarians. And it can become so effective and grow so large that the country now is unable to take independent policy action. So decisions that you would think would be in the country's national interest, diversification of key sectors, encouraging the highest standards, they are eliminated, or individuals that have been placed in specific positions prevent that from happening. So it becomes a very corrosive element. What we found in the case study countries, and some of this was brought to us by revelations in the Panama Papers and elsewhere. Sometimes that good investigative journalism and openness can open researchers' eyes as well, that we saw that some of these local affiliates had, and through their intermediaries, there was some direct connections to some of the most well-known of the Kremlin's inner circle. So we did see that this was a very purposeful approach. Again, just some of the key highlights. The corruption end of it is the transmission. It can create those dependencies, and once that feedback loop becomes so strong between the economics influences the politics, sometimes the politics influences the economics, and it grows that cycle. And that's what leads us to what we've argued as state capture, meaning that it becomes so overwhelming, independent action is proven difficult. So what's the point here? Why is it working so effectively? And I think this is where we come to the point of the, we're getting close to the aha of what we found in the report. The political influence is really about weakening the internal cohesion of these countries and of these societies. Sometimes it's about obstructing reform, so they cannot improve themselves. Sometimes it's making sure that the inherent fragility of these systems and democracies are, we have free and fair elections, that's always a bit of volatility, that this is something that is continued to sort of overemphasize the dysfunction of democracy. It's utilizing individuals that are going to be a challenge to the democratic system, and this is where the use of political party financing can sometimes weigh in. And what we found is increasingly as the economic and the political influence began to grow, that actually debates about issues very important to the Kremlin, sanctions policy, energy diversification policy, those started to become very difficult for the countries to maintain. You started to hear leaders changing their views, changing their policies. And this is where we see some of the broader objectives. There is, in fact, a systemic war on information. And as we saw the economic influence grow, it was entering the media and telecommunications sector. That reduces independent voices. The other war on information part that I think is particularly challenging for the United States and for Europe is the fact that we don't know what fact is. When you have media stations and reports that obscure the truth, or you don't know what the truth is, or there are various stories to tell you, the people don't know what to believe. And what happens, what we found in instances where governments were spending a lot of time batting down stories that were patently false, but that was what the media was generating for them to respond to. It can be extremely disorienting. It can paralyze government institutions. And again, the media environment is quite restricted. Again, the other part of the unvirtuous circle, there's a real commingling of public and private interests. Dr. Shentov sort of said a joke to me in the beginning. He said the joke was a son goes to his father and he says, I want to be involved in organized crime. And the father goes, would that be private or public? And so in some ways, the commingling of private and public, that, again, is a challenge if that's not clear, and it allows those private interests to acquire privileged access to these strategic sectors. Why energy? Well, they have the links there, but it's an enormous sector. Why finance and banking? It's like, why do you rob a bank? That's where the money is. That's where the money is. That is where we have, each country has enormous resources. State has very powerful control and interest over those key strategic sectors. And if you can influence in them, you can challenge them and transform them. So what are the overall objectives of the playbook? So clearly, it's the money, it's economics. This is about maximizing economic benefits and enriching members of the inner circle, whether they are at the local affiliate level, at the national level, or the international level. And I think one of the issues, and Ruslan will mention this a little bit when we talk about the recommendations, you know, it's highly ironic that sometimes European Union funds have been used in the furtherance of the cycle if they're not watched carefully of how they're doing, and it's a cautionary tale that sometimes we may be involved unknowingly in furthering of corruptive efforts. I think the second bullet for me and the third bullet are what is the big reason why we all care about this issue. And some have, if they've reviewed the report, have said to me, well, what's the big deal? You know, countries have big economic interests and that comes with influence. The second bullet is the big deal. It's because ultimately it's about breaking the transatlantic consensus. It's about challenging our own democracies and the strength of those democracies. And maintaining the international liberal order. And why this is so important is because it fits into a very critical element of Russia's new generation warfare, which, as stated doctrine, is primarily a strategy of influence, not of brute force. Its primary goal is breaking the internal coherence of the enemy system. And when you so paralyze a democracy, you confuse it, you tarnish it, it's corrupt, it's ripping you off, it can't respond to you, you don't believe in the whole system. And then you're much more available to think about either other approaches or perhaps being willing to accommodate very difficult issues that you wouldn't normally accommodate if you were a healthy, thriving democracy. So that's the playbook. But now what do we do about it? So I'm going to do the first part of the recommendations that deal with the United States and NATO, and then I'm going to invite Ruslan up here, and he's going to talk a little bit more about the European Union. Step one, understand this is something much larger than what we think it is. When I've looked at Central Europe for over 15, 20 years, we tend to look at the individual issues. Oh, there's a political problem here. Oh my goodness, what a strange economic decision they're making. We don't look at the totality of it. We don't look how it works together. Recognize the playbook. And once you recognize it, you better be prepared to dedicate an enormous amount of policy resources and financial resources to break the transmission mechanism and develop greater antibodies or resilience against it. So we want to focus on the transmission mechanism, and that's corruption, and that's about tracking how this illicit financing flows. This is about us. As much as we're talking about tactics and techniques that Russia may offer, this is about how our system acknowledges them and responds to them. We better track them. We better have a better understanding at the most senior levels of our government and of European governments how this is working. We argue for a much more high-level focused effort at the Treasury Department to track and prosecute if in fact these illicit funds are using the US financial system. We have to encourage our NATO members to see this not as a governance challenge, but as a national security threat. We have to start tracking these illicit funds and having NATO think of this as an element of collective defense and security. It's not, though, just, obviously we want to heighten NATO's awareness and attention, and we think new positions like the NATO Assistant Secretary General for Intelligence and Warning can play an important role in that. The toolbox here is with the EU, and trying to think through US-EU cooperation, we need to use this much more powerfully. Hopefully a new summit with a new US administration can start looking at this very holistically and start getting at stopping our systems from facilitating this influence. And as I mentioned, certainly again, getting back to NATO's more holistic focus on this. Finally, I think, and this is not a criticism, it's just a change, US government assistance in this region has gone to nothing, has diminished greatly. We understand that. They are successful members of the European Union and NATO. Well, our analysis suggests perhaps that success needs to be revisited. Perhaps the US needs to completely refocus its efforts and its assistance programs on this region, particularly in the Western Balkans where we're still active. But now we have to prioritize how we break these links, open procurement systems, putting transparency into this as a matter of priority, independence of the judiciary, investigative journalism. That's not in the nice to do category. That's critically important to the health of this country as a NATO member, as a member of the European Union. So we need to take this very seriously. And then I'll invite Ruslan up here to finish us up here on what the EU to do, and then you can join us in our conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Heather. Indeed, it's a simple 2 slides on what the EU should do and member states. But let me just, before I just flip them over, let me just go back a bit to the point of 2008, because this is when we think the switch happened from opportunity to intent. And this was very widely proclaimed, actually, by Kremlin, that they're no longer prepared and they're going to very actively seek to recapture Eastern Europe, because they're no longer going to allegedly support, through energy prices, Eastern Europe at the expense of the European Commission. So they say the European Commission is already not able to support these countries, and we think that if not, then welcome back. And the critical thing here is state capture. Let me underscore this. What we were noting is that there's nothing wrong with the Russian economic footprint in Central and Eastern Europe. It's between 11 and 22%. But what is really worrying is that after 2008 in particular, there have been 2 trends when Kremlin has actually used corporate presence to advance its political goals, number one. And secondly, it might have even overthrown governments, interfered with internal political decisions, and that is what is worrying. And that is why we think that the European Union should focus on 3 key issues. And these are demonopolizing or using more decisively the anti-monopoly competition authorities of the European Commission of the nation states, not only at European level, but looking at specific geographic markets, in particular in energy, banking, and transport. And finally, let me go to the bottom line again, is that the EU should also revamp, strengthen its anti-corruption, good governance, assistance mechanisms all across the Union. It seems that it's getting there, but it's taking more than a decade until now. We think that it needs to happen much faster. And with this, let me conclude our presentation and invite you to also find our report at CSIS website. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruslan. Let me ask Cathy.
I'd like to join us, and we'll have the podium moved here so we can join the conversation. Thank you, Cathy, so much. Cathy Kavala is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs, with responsibilities for policy towards Russia and the region. Prior to becoming Deputy Assistant Secretary, Cathy served as the Director for Russian Affairs in the European Bureau, and prior to that, Deputy Chief of Mission at UNESCO in Paris, and was the Deputy Coordinator for U.S. assistance to Europe and Eurasia. So you're Cathy, perfectly placed because you do the policy and the assistance part, and this is where these two streams come together. So welcome. We know, and I thank you so much for being here, because we know this is not an easy subject for the government to talk about. At least we found it difficult to get some of our colleagues to come and share with us what we need to think about this and what we need to do. So welcome, and we welcome your reflections.
Right. Well, first of all, good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for hosting me here. And we're really happy, very pleased to see this report released. We think this is an important subject. It needs attention, and I think one of the more important things, and you had this in your slide, is recognizing what the playbook is, recognizing what we're dealing with. I think we're seeing behaviors and activities that surprise us and unsettle us, but it's important to kind of step back and see the whole and see what may be behind it. So I think your report tries to do that, and I think that's a great service to all of us as policymakers and as members of the Western Alliance. I think this is a welcome addition to how Russia is implementing its foreign policy, a policy that seems to increasingly reject the post-Cold War order in Europe. Russia's aggression in Ukraine is the most obvious demonstration that Moscow is willing to undermine existing rules. And while the action in Ukraine is unique, we're seeing coordinated and aggressive actions by Russia elsewhere in Europe and in the United States. We agree these actions appear to be designed to weaken core institutions in the West, such as NATO and the EU, and to cast doubt on the integrity of our democratic systems. Russia's method is not to advance ideas to compete with ours, but to undermine and question narratives and to create confusion or divert attention from Moscow. Peter Pomerantsev has documented that the aim of Russia's information operations is to use disinformation cascades to advance the notion that the truth doesn't matter. For example, by propagating multiple theories of the MH17 shoot-down, Russia aims to create confusion and leave the public with the impression that the truth is unknowable or that no one can be believed because everyone has an agenda. Russia appears to have a similar goals in other spheres: politics, civil society, and cyber. So let me just mention a few examples, and you've already touched on many of these. Disinformation, of course, in which Russia uses disinformation and propaganda, taking full advantage of the internet and new technologies. We know about the troll farms, and we've seen other examples of this behavior. Political parties, you've mentioned and touched on this. There's growing evidence uncovered by journalists about Russian connections with anti-establishment populist political parties in Germany, Hungary, and Austria. And we all have read the stories about the National Front in France borrowing money from Russian bank. Civil society, the Russian government appears to be more willing to infiltrate and try to manipulate civil society out of Russia, even creating false flag NGOs. In April, SAPO, the Swedish Security Service, took the extraordinary step of discussing in public how persons linked to Russian intelligence were participating in public debates over cooperation with NATO on the anti-NATO side. And then, of course, cyber, which has been in the news, and you made reference to Friday's announcement from the Department of Homeland Security and our intelligence community, points to another area of endeavor. So what can we do in the West? And we welcome the suggestions. I think these are important. One thing I would just stress is that as we look at the range of activities, it's really a whole of government effort. We're not talking, maybe in the old days we worried about espionage and military activity. I mean, now we're looking at a broad range of activities, and the response can't just focus on one area. It has to be coordinated, and it has to look at various lines of effort and what we need to do to strengthen our own defenses, and for example in cyber, which we're seeing is a real vulnerability given the way the internet has been constructed. The other thing, of course, is cooperation with local partners and NATO allies, with the EU, with NATO, first of all to discuss, to share information, but then to coordinate and see what we can do together. I want to stress that as we discuss this behavior, that our long-term objective remains to have Russia as a global responsible player integrated into Western institutions. Although Russia has kind of shifted the direction, I think the best outcome for all of us is to have a constructive, cooperative partner that agrees and plays by the rules that we have found to be so helpful to our democracies and our economic prosperity in the West. But until that time, when Russia wants to return and redirect itself in that direction, I think we need to confront the problems we're facing, and we need a flexible policy that pushes back on Russian aggression, helps our partners build resilience and the antibodies to deal with this kind of behavior. We want to cooperate, continue to cooperate with Moscow when it's possible, and we want to maintain our ties to the Russian people. So let me stop there and be happy to join your conversation.
Cathy, thank you so much, and that we'll just have a moment or two just discussion here, and then we really would welcome your thoughts, your comments. This is a lot to digest. We appreciate that in a short period of time. Two things as you were talking that struck me, both my own personal reflections here in Washington, as well as some of the output of the report. My concern is we don't understand and don't place the priority and the urgency that this may be taking place. In my view, just looking at the U.S. experience, this is incredibly bold. And we have a generation that's not familiar with the language of active measures. But this isn't just active measures as we understood them in the Cold War. Because of 25 years of integration, of trying to work with Russia, bring them into our institutions and our partnerships and our relationships, their methodology is happening inside our system, using our system, and I feel like the surprise and the what's going on, and in some ways that's the difference here. And that whole of government approach, it's just the problem is the whole of government isn't focusing on this, it has different issues. So I'd welcome your, the urgency and the priority, which I think now more than ever has to be placed. I'm looking for it desperately. The second comment I have, and this is perhaps where we slightly disagree, while absolutely Russian efforts are designed to undermine and erode the credibility of the West, we posit a view that perhaps, though, it's demonstrating an alternative model to the West. And this is where I think the behavior of such figures as Prime Minister Orban and others, the figure of the strongman, the one who's reducing independence of media, control over key judicial issues. That is how we, to use the slogan from the Leave campaign in the UK, that's how we take control. That's how we get our hands over this globalization. But in the challenge, though, is this Kremlin model is now becoming more attractive to the very countries that we thought were permanently attracted to how democratic systems work. And just tough questions, no good answers, but let's just throw one out and then we'll welcome our audience to the conversation.
I completely agree with you on the urgency. This is why I think your report is so important and so timely. We need more studies like this. I hope that other institutions are looking at this. I know I've worked a lot with allied and partner governments when I travel in Europe. This is a frequent conversation, and because it's new and because it's kind of so all-encompassing, it's going to take a little while, I'm sure, because we have to figure out what are the steps that we need to take and what's most at risk, and is it financial? Strengthening journalism, for instance, is very important. Fighting corruption. All these things are things that have always been important to us, but have become even more important now. And I think your point about the resources is a critical one as we go through our own election, and we will be welcoming a new administration. That administration needs to, figure out what its priorities are. But I think this should be front and center as they look at funding and where they want to put their resources. On the other question, I think certainly, that's another key question is kind of political trends, which I think is probably something I don't want to dive into too deeply as a public servant here on the eve of an election in the United States, except to say that, I think it just points to the need to come back to basic values, democratic values, to remind ourselves and the public of why these democratic systems are so important, why these, what the risks are if you go on an alternative path, and these are systems that exist that come out of World War II, of other experiences that point to what can go wrong if we don't find a stable democratic system that allows for give and take and for ideas and kind of a balance of interests, what the risks may be. So now more than ever, on the eve of our election, on the eve of other elections in Europe, this is an important message, and we see lots of op-ed writers opining on the topic today. So let me just stop and leave it there.
Absolutely. No, and in 2017 for Europe, after we get through our election process, Dutch elections, French presidential election, German parliamentary elections, we have Austrian presidential elections.
Right.
This is a very big year, and I think the playbook needs to be viewed through that optic. I'd love to take some questions from the audience. We have, unfortunately, a shortage of time. And then after I take some questions, Ruslan, I also want to hear, because you work very closely with the European Commission on all of these issues, what you're hearing from your European counterparts when they hear this idea, what is their reaction to that? I'd welcome that. So great, we have a few questions here. We'll start right there in the front. If you could please introduce yourself, your affiliation, and I'm so sorry about the time. Keep your questions brutally short, please.
Sure, thank you. I'm Laura Jewett from the National Democratic Institute. I'd be very interested to hear a little bit more about the Latvia case and what is it specifically about Latvia that made it more resilient than the other case studies.
Wonderful, thank you. And we have Stephen Blank here, please.
Stephen Blank, American Foreign Policy Council. It sounds like an extraordinary study, but I'm questioning why is it that nobody looked at the Russian influence either through organized crime or through media, because we know that many media empires in Central and Eastern Europe are financed by Russia or have actual Russian ownership.
And colleague right there in front, please, sorry. Thank you.
Thanks. John Hudson with Foreign Policy Magazine. Thanks. I just wanted to ask Cathy, what's the appropriate response to Russian hacking on the DNC? Some have talked about on the extreme end, taking out an electric grid. Admiral Stavridis, writing for Foreign Policy last night, suggested taking out Russia's online censor architecture on the internet. What's the right response? And if you can't talk about specific retaliatory measures, what message do we want the Russians to understand by the response we give them if we do?
So I'm just going to take those 3 questions here, and then we'll see if we can squeeze in a second round before we go. On the Latvia case, and just for the interest of time, would welcome you to we do a deep case study dive into that experience. What we found were a couple of factors. Some of it was there is some higher level recognition within Latvia's political culture about being more acknowledging the potential of the influence that could exist. But what we found really one of the key elements was Latvia's unique construct of its anti-corruption office and its independence, as well as some very early investment in judicial reform. This anti-corruption office very unusually does not report to Parliament, and you think that would be very odd because obviously Parliament should have oversight of these type of things, but it actually removed it. And what we were finding in similar cases, when parliamentarians were put in charge of some of the oversight, it was in fact some of these individuals that had been influenced. And so when they pushed it out, it was actually quite independent, now at great risk. There were assassination attempts against the deputy director. It has been a fight, and this is we're all works in progress in this department, and I don't mean to be judgmental in any way, but they were able to assert themselves independently, but there's still enormous challenges, and Latvia recognizes there are still enormous challenges. So I encourage you to read in the deep dive of the thing, but there are some good lessons learned, I think, from Latvia. Ruslan, do you want to handle the organized crime, and I'll let Cathy figure out how she's going to handle John's question. I'm glad you didn't tell me, John. Thank you. Ruslan.
Well, actually, it's a very good question. We've dealt with that in the report, and that's why I want to underscore the state capture thing. We did look at the ownership, corporate ownership of media, and it actually goes in a really very dense networks in telecommunications that are able to spread multiple news stories from seemingly unrelated news outlets, besides the very visible corporate presence. So this makes it even more difficult. But what's really important is there are 2 aspects to that. One is because it's targeting the 2 most important checks and balances in our democratic systems. One is the media, and the other one's that within the state, that's the judiciary. And talking about the European Commission, we've done an EU 28 study on the relationship between corruption, links between corruption and organized crime, how organized crime is using corruption to access state power. And the difference between what we have in Western Europe and Eastern Europe has been the access of organized crime to judiciary in Eastern Europe without exception. So we're talking about from the Baltics down to Southeast Europe. And that makes it really difficult. That's why we wanted to focus very much laser sharp on state capture. And the example of Latvia shows that. If we're able to get our financial intelligence units, our organized crime units, our regulatory bodies working on concentration on monopolies, that is going to reduce the pressure. That is the antidote in a way, we think.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Cathy.
Well, I'm happy to say that, first of all, it's not the State Department that's taking the lead on what the response will be. I think that's better a question directed to the White House, the intelligence community, and Department of Homeland Security. But in terms of response, there needs to be a thoughtful, principled, strong response that sends a clear message and assigns responsibility and makes clear that we won't tolerate future intrusions. But the other part of it, and I know Department of Homeland Security is working on this, is our own resilience and a defense of our own systems. I think it's a broader issue on cyber, but let me just leave it there.
Okay, I think I take one more question. Woman in the green, please, and then I'm sorry, time is, but we'll be available for after the conversation. Yes, ma'am, please.
On the timing of when this, I'm sorry, Allison Balzer from Booz Allen Hamilton.
Thank you.
On the timing of when this redirection started, how much of it do you think relates to U.S. recognition of Kosovo kind of unilaterally over Russian disinterests or interests?
Well, and again, in the report, thank you so much. And we put a timeline on sort of key events, the Georgia-Russian conflict and other things. And each country had different points. But just getting back to what Ruslan said, what we found from the 2004 to 2008 period, it was what we call opportunity. There were existing networks, they were being explored. We think in that period there was a lot of European investment that was sort of coming in post EU membership that perhaps was crowding that out. It was more competitive. We did believe that the 2007-2008 period represented a shift. So we sort of point, many people point, I know even in the security and defense field, President Putin's historic speech in 2007 to the Munich Security Conference, where he was signaling, I believe, a very significant shift in policy. And then, of course, what's hard to separate is, was it intention or was it the global economic recession that created a multitude of things? Russian capital was fleeing, Russia itself, trying to get into safer areas. But that is where, again, and then the Russia-Georgia conflict, where this was now becoming a confrontation in the buffer zone, if you will, I hate that term, but if we want to call it that. And then we saw the acceleration of the use of the economics and the politics that was starting to then create that vicious circle, that unvirtuous circle, where it was growing. And today we see where it is a challenge to maintain unity of purpose and policy on EU sanctions against Russia. It is difficult now that far anti-European, anti-American, anti-parties, it's sort of fill in the blank, are now growing to such predominance on the scene at a moment when there's such an enormous crisis of confidence in how democracies are viewing themselves and the way forward in a very disruptive society, of which the Russian government is very adept at helping us with that disruption. So we did see the difference. We think it is a policy, which is why we keep saying that looking at these in isolated issues, individual economic cases of corruption, it exists in all of our societies, that quite frankly there is the difference here is how it is being used and its ultimate objective. And that's the part we all must recognize and take action. It's about us. It's about our societies. And that is what we have to focus on. And sometimes that's the hardest part to focus on, how we're doing.
Yeah, if I can just take a little bit of exception to the idea that of the impact of all of this behavior. I think that it's important to stress, while there are pressures, for example, to lift sanctions, or have been pressure to lift sanctions on Russia over Ukraine. I think what's more striking over the last period is the unity that we have built in the transatlantic alliance. Sanctions have continued. They have been rolled over multiple times. I think when they were first introduced on a transatlantic basis, people were surprised that we, achieved that level of unity, that the unity is held as long as it has. While all of these are challenges, I don't think we should overstate, certainly we should recognize the risks, but I don't think we should overstate the impact. I think the fact that some of these behaviors are so blatant, so flagrant, that they create their own antibodies. When we think about the Lisa case in Germany and the shock, the shock that Lavrov persisted in insisting that an event that did not happen happened in light of clear evidence that it had not happened, created such a shock and recognition and raised a lot of questions about what Russia was trying to do. So I think some of the pushback will occur naturally as people see and confront what is happening and reject it, and a lot of that will happen naturally, and through the institutions that we have. I think we're stronger than we recognize, but I think we always have to be aware of what we're dealing with.
That is the perfect way to end the conversation. We rushed through this. You've been extremely patient as we explained a very long and dense report. Thank you so much. Please go to the website, download the report, and thank you for attending the premiere of the Kremlin Playbook. Thank you so much.